Is your heart racing? This is just the tip of the iceberg. Subscribe to our channel, and don't miss a single thrilling twist in Grace's story. Chapter 30. Deal with the devil. Vincent woke, with the salty taste of leather in his mouth. He blinked, felt the grit of sandpaper beneath his eyelids, and blinked again. He was staring at a blood-red leather pillow. He opened his eyes fully, rolling over to better survey his circumstances, and toppled to the plush-carpeted floor. At which point he realized he was naked and that he wasn't alone. Sounds of a woman singing off-key could be heard over the rush of a shower. He rubbed his eyes, shrugged into a wrinkled, sweat-stained scrub top that he supposed was his, and scooped up the matching pants. Eve? Although he'd never heard her sing before, it was easy to recognize the faint southern accent. And this was Eve's office. He leaned on the desk, searching below it for shoes, socks, stray articles of clothing. His head swam as he straightened once more. The room burst into a kaleidoscope of fragments. His stomach lurched, then settled down once his vision cleared. He licked his lips. Damn, he was thirsty. Parched. His stomach rumbled. Hungry too. How could he be nauseated and starving at the same time? He remembered dinner last night. Surely he hadn't stayed after. He couldn't have, he was on call. Nevertheless, here he was. His body ached, in a pleasant way. Had he and Eve? No, not while he was on call could he have. He ran his fingers through his hair, trying to remember. Tantalizing fragments teased his memory, a woman's laugh, hands stroking him, a woman on her knees, begging. He stepped into his shoes, found further evidence of the night's debauchery in the scattered remnants of Eve's desktop paraphernalia. God, had he taken her on the desk? A whisper image of a woman on her knees, calling his name, the floor as well. And had she really done that for him, to him? His head pounded as the random pictures flashed through his brain, a private porn video produced just for him. Except he couldn't remember a damn thing. The feelings that came with the images weren't pleasurable. Rather he felt shame, as if he'd betrayed someone. He moved to the open bathroom door, heard the water stop. He stole a glance inside, trying not to feel embarrassed as he watched Eve step through the glass shower door, her back to him. Two mutually consenting adults, there was nothing to be embarrassed about. Then he saw the bruises on her porcelain skin. Fresh bruises. Bite marks, handprints, scratch marks. Vincent backed away in horror. Had he done that to her? Why? How? His gaze darted around the room, returned to his rumpled and disheveled appearance. What the hell had happened here last night? Without a word to Eve, he turned and fled. After a quick shower and changing into clean clothes, Vincent still had no answers, but felt closer to normal. His head pounded every time he moved too fast, and despite brushing his teeth twice, he couldn't escape the lingering taste of stale, acrid dried venison. A childhood treat he'd learned to despise with time. Coffee. He needed coffee. He stumbled down the steps, the elevator was far too noisy and his stomach far too queasy, and approached the cafeteria. Then saw a familiar figure in a pair of rumpled scrubs. Grace Moran. Heading toward the ethics committee meeting. Headache or not, he rushed forward to grab her by the arm. What are you doing here? She narrowed her eyes at him, then turned and squared her shoulders as if willing him into oblivion. We need to talk, Vincent told her, as he pulled her into a side corridor. She allowed him to steer her, but from the steel bands of muscle tensing beneath his fingers he knew he couldn't keep her there if she didn't want to stay. What happened to your promise? You said you would wait for me in Alex's room. She remained silent, merely staring at him with those disconcertingly blue eyes. Her expression made him wince, feel ashamed again, as if somehow she knew more about what he'd done last night than he did, as if he'd somehow betrayed her. He tore his gaze away, spun on his heel to pace the confined space, from the janitor's closet to the main corridor and back, hands fisted in his pockets, head down until he came toe-to-toe with her once more. I don't understand you. Why torture yourself for 4 years by clinging to the house your husband was killed in? You're a doctor, you of all people know that death happens and life goes on. She jerked back, head raised high at his words. It wasn't the question he'd meant to ask, but it was the question he needed answered. Her gaze blazed into his, then softened a bit, as if she realized he wasn't condemning her actions, but rather was desperate to understand, to learn. Life does go on, she said, her voice ringing clear through the small area. People return to their routines, rejoin the world. Leave their grief behind. That's what's supposed to be healthy, right? Of course. Not for me. I'd rather live alone with my memories of Jimmy the good and the bad than risk losing him forever. Risk waking up one day and not being able to remember his voice, the color his eyes change to when we make love, the touch of his hand. So you've what? Made yourself a living shrine to a man dead and buried for years. What are you, Grace? A walking tombstone. His words emerged sharper than he'd intended, but he didn't care. He was sick and tired of hearing what a Saint Jimmy Moran had been, how no one alive could measure up to the man. At least I fight for what I hold dear. Her glare almost forced him back, but he took a deep breath and held his ground. Anyway, better that than to go back. Her voice dropped and her gaze tore away from his, darting around like a trapped animal seeking an escape route. Go back out there. To the so-called real world. Suddenly she seemed diminished, dwarfed by the fear that had consumed and ruled her these past 4 years. She sank back against the wall, hugged her arms to her chest like a little girl. Maybe I can't do this, she whispered, her gaze fixed on a spot between her feet. Just forget that you found me, let me go. He reached a hand out and gently stroked her hair away from her face. Her silent weeping resonated through his fingers. You're not afraid of losing Jimmy. Or of dying. You're afraid of living. He pulled her close for a long moment, his hand caressing her hair. But that's life, Grace. The pain and the risk and the not knowing and the glorious hope that it will all work out in the end. You won't find any answers trapped behind the walls you've built. She was silent. He knew it sounded weak. Hallmark sentiments versus the love of a lifetime. How could anyone compete with the legend she'd built Jimmy Moran into? By her reasoning, no one would ever leave their nice warm beds to venture out into the cold, cruel world. What about Alex? He tried another tact. Guilt. It always worked for his mother when she wanted to motivate Vincent. He needs you to stay with him. You can't abandon him now. She pushed back from his arms and snapped her head up to meet his eyes. Why not? You did. He thought you cared enough about him to respect his choice. I do care. But he's just a kid. He knows what he wants. No, he doesn't. Besides, there's still hope. Now who's living in the fantasy world? He moved away from her, regained his balance. A bottomless chasm separated them. She tried to push past him, heading toward the conference room, but he blocked her path. Hellman is on the committee. If he sees you, he'll have you committed, force you to have the surgery. Maybe he won't recognize me. The man's been inside your brain, I think he'll recognize you. Grace looked up at Vincent. Could you? I know it's a lot to ask. He shook his head and would not meet her eyes. Please, don't ask me to. I can't go in there and argue for them to let Alex die. Not while there's the slightest hope, I just can't do it. Vincent, it's what he wants, you know it is. He's been through so much pain. You would let him keep suffering. Grace, we've had this argument before. You know how I feel. Alex is too young to make this decision himself. There are new drugs and treatments every day. I like the kid, I really do, but I can't let him throw his life away like this. Not when there's a chance I can save him. So your God complex overrules Alex's right to decide his own fate. That's not fair and you know it. Fine. Whatever. I'm going to the ethics committee and you can't stop me. You won't let Hellman operate on you for your own sake, but you'll give yourself up to him for a kid you didn't know until 2 days ago. His voice took on an edge. He trapped her against the wall, caged between his arms. Why couldn't she do this for him? See what she meant to him, a real man, not some imaginary ghost. Would you do it for me? Have the surgery. Buy us some time to get to know each other better. Her brow creased into a frown and she looked away, giving him his answer. He sucked in his breath, gave it one last shot. I think I love you, Grace. God help me, I have no earthly idea how it happened or why, but I do. As soon as he said the words, heard them aloud, he realized how foolish they were. You don't love me. You love the idea of someone you can save. She raised her head, her eyes wide with defiance. I don't need saving, Vincent. I know what I have to do. I don't need your help or your approval. She pushed his arm aside and stalked away. He jogged after her. Let me go first, explain to Hellman how I found you. Are you more worried about me or your job? That's not fair. I could have told him who you were yesterday. If you go in there, will you tell Hellman I won't have the surgery unless he makes sure Alex gets his DNR? I can't do that, talk to him that way. He's the chief of neurosurgery. She tossed her head. You may not have the guts to make a deal with the devil, but I do. Probably because I've got nothing left to lose but my soul. She halted in front of the door to the conference room, her palms spread flat against it as if testing for flames. Then she raised her head and turned to him. Her eyes were clear, resolute, and he knew he had lost. Goodbye, Vincent. She turned the knob and plunged into the inferno that waited beyond. He shook his head and started after her, wanted to pull her back, to save her from the fire. But then he stopped, chewing his lip, as he regarded the solid panel of wood between him and her. She didn't want saving, not really. And that was really the heart of the matter, wasn't it? He now knew what he had to do. Time to leave fantasy land and return to the real world, the one where he was facing a malpractice suit, had bills to pay, and a living to earn. He turned and walked away, tugging his lab coat by the lapels, the mantle of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This is what doctors did. They made decisions, weighed the evidence, knew what was best for their patients and acted upon that knowledge. Eve Warden. She was his last hope to salvage the career Grace was about to send up in flames. Leaving Jimmy snoring in the company of the children, sneaking out before any of them woke, had been one of the hardest things Grace had ever done. She didn't think she'd have the strength to go through with this. Just the thought of losing precious time with him made her desperate to run back upstairs to his warm and loving arms. But Vincent's words strengthened her resolve. Someone had to be an advocate for the children, and it obviously wasn't the chief resident. Grace pushed through the door to the conference room. Hellman, seated in the chair at the head of the table, looked up at her, eyes blazing at the interruption. A stack of charts sat before him and his mouth was open, as if he'd been ready to issue a proclamation. What is it? He snapped. The other committee members were a blur in Grace's peripheral vision. This is a confidential meeting. And I have something to discuss with you in confidence, Dr. Hellman. She swallowed hard and took the 2 steps necessary to reach his side. Who the hell are you? Are you on the agenda? Why wasn't I notified of this? His gaze swept the table, raking over the huddled committee members. My name is Grace Moran, she said, sweeping her hair back to reveal the surgical staples in her scalp. I would like to discuss an experimental surgical procedure with you, as well as several other matters. She turned to the others who were shuffling their papers nervously. Alone, please. The rest of the committee bolted before Hellman had a chance to dismiss them. His cheeks blossomed with fury, but to his credit he said nothing, merely shifting in his seat to reach for the water pitcher and pour himself a glass. "Do you realize the trouble you've caused me?" he asked after taking a sip. "You mean like sending a stranger to rummage through my house? Like prying into my personal affairs?" Dr. Embark was most thorough in his efforts to find me, she said, taking the seat beside him and reaching for her own glass of water. She needed it, fear had leached her mouth dry. Too bad he hasn't been as interested in protecting the welfare of his own patients. Hellman bristled at that. "That's quite an inflammatory charge, young lady. Care to explain it?" "First, I need your word that you'll hear me out. If you agree to my terms, I'll have your surgery. Agree to any treatment course you want, no questions." His chuckle rattled off the paneled walls. "You'll have the surgery one way or the other with your psych history. I can have you involuntarily committed." "I sincerely doubt it, Doctor. I know the law as well as you, maybe even better. Up until 4 years ago, I was a physician in the ER here at Angels of Mercy." That caught his attention. "All right," he conceded. "What's so important that you'll risk your life by making this ridiculous bargain?" "First, your word. I want you to present Alex Weiss' case to the ethics committee and get him the DNR he wants. And I want Catherine Jellicle to remain on PEDS until her surgery. You have to promise that she'll never have to go back to the ECU or be under the care of Eve Warden again." His eyes squinted into a suspicious stare. "Eve? What's she got to do with this?" "Everything." Grace inhaled, forced her voice to remain steady, and told him about Warden's abuse of Lucidine and what was going on up in the ECU. When she was finished, he shook his head. "Basically it boils down to the girl's word against that of a renowned and respected physician," he said. "You can't blame Eve if her night staff has gotten slack, allowed a few loose cannons to roam." "Loose cannons? They attacked me and Kat." "Ah, but you said yourself, you're the one who used the pool stick against them. You're lucky they don't press charges." He frowned. "I'll have to ask Eve about that. You might have placed the hospital in a very difficult position. One patient assaulting another. You mean 5 against 1, don't you?" Grace pushed her chair away. This had been a huge mistake, coming here. "Sit down, young lady." When she didn't comply immediately, he pounded his fist on the table. The stack of glasses jumped, the top one falling over, shattering on the polished oak tabletop. As the echo of crashing glass faded, Grace remained standing, leaning against the table, palms flat, forcing all the weight of her anger and frustration into her glare. "Last chance, Dr. Hellman. Will you give Alex his DNR and guarantee Kat's safety, or do I go to the press? Spread it far and wide how you not only lost a desperately ill patient, but then allowed that same patient to be assaulted in your hospital." Hellman rose to his feet, towering over her, his face ruddy as he tried to stare her down. Grace planted her feet, refusing to bow. He blew his breath out, his lips twisting together, as if he were swallowing something unpleasant. "You'll have the surgery." "Yes. If you agree to my terms." "That's all, just the DNR and moving Jellicle to PEDS. And investigate what's going on up in the ECU." He gave a small nod of his head. "You realize, of course, that to prepare for the surgery, you'll need to be admitted to the ECU yourself, undergo the brain mapping procedure. With Lucidine." It took every ounce of her strength not to let her voice quaver. Sweat pooled at the base of her spine, but despite it she was shivering. "Yes." The corners of his mouth turned up in a feral smile. "All right then. Done?" He extended his hand across the table. Grace reached out with her own and took it. His grip was crushing, but her own fingers were strong enough from climbing to squeeze back with a force that obviously he hadn't expected. To her surprise, the wasps were silent. There was no crawling under her skin, no dampening of her vision. "Let's go," he said as he released her. "Now?" No, she needed to get back to Jimmy before his time was up. But what was she to say? "Excuse me while I return to my dead husband's ghost." "Of course now. You don't think I'm going to give you the chance to run away again, do you?" He marched around the table and took her by the arm. "Come on, we've work to do." He opened the door and propelled her out into the hallway. As they crossed the lobby to the elevators, a gleeful voice sounded behind them. "Jonas, thank heavens you found her." Grace pivoted. Eve Warden emerged from the elevator, face beaming as she approached Grace. She took Grace by both arms, ignoring Grace's attempt to pull away. For one awful moment Grace thought Warden might try to kiss her on her cheeks, European style. But instead the physician merely held her at arm's length, inspecting her, as if she were damaged property. "Thank goodness you're all right, Grace. I've got everything ready for your treatment." Eve turned to Hellman, her smile widening. "I should have known you'd find her. Bring her to me, Jonas. Now we can make sure that everything goes smoothly for your surgery." She released one of Grace's arms to stroke her hand against Hellman's. "I'm so proud to be part of this. You're going to make history, Jonas." The words came to Grace in a blur, as she fought to remain standing. Wasps buzzed, encircling her heart, squeezing tighter and tighter as they stung. Her lips and hands were numb, as if parts of her body were already dying beneath Eve's touch. Chapter 31 Sweet dreams. Alex slept, his arms wrapped around Jimmy's chest. It was the first time since he'd left his mother's womb that he'd had the chance to sleep with the heartbeat of another person echoing his, rocking him into his dreams. In his dreams, the sky was a brilliant blue, its colors shimmering in warm sunshine. The breeze was sweet with the scent of honeysuckle, and new spring grass rustled beneath his bare feet. Alex sighed. This was his all-time favorite dream. Made better now with the addition of a family. Warm arms surrounded him, cradled him. A woman's laugh. Graces circled around him, snuggling him in its embrace. She was answered by Kat's mischievous chuckle, and he closed his eyes, content to drift in the joyous harmony. Grace's voice soothed him, as his breath caught, and a quick spiral of pain shot through his chest. Kat held one hand and Grace the other. Sunshine warmed his face, danced in bright plumes of crimson through his closed eyelids. Alex allowed himself to fall into the blissful realm that beckoned. Lucas was reliving his favorite dream. The day he met Grace, the day they fell in love. He remembered his embarrassment. A man his age 28 he'd been back then. 6 years ago shouldn't lose control like that, punch a wall just because his mother had left him again, extending her stay in Washington. After all, he had a job to do, so did she. Together, she had promised, they were going to change the world. Just the two of them. Because Lucas was special, so very special. He'd taken the bus to Angels of Mercy. Actually 2 buses and a walk of almost a mile. But he didn't drive and couldn't stand to ask George, the chauffeur and handyman, who was responsible for Lucas when his mother was gone. Sure, George pretended that he was really watching out for the estate, that he and Lucas were buddies, but Lucas knew better. He'd seen the gleam in George's eyes whenever his mother handed him an extra bulky envelope before she'd leave for a lengthy trip. It was the same look his father's whores had when Earl had plied them with free drugs and cash. That same measuring look that they'd cast over Lucas, weighing if allowing him to watch was worth the payoff, deciding if they were selling their special services too cheap. George had been particularly condescending, laughing when Lucas had become immersed in his mother's latest assignment, a feasibility study of a reintroduction of a bill designed to circumvent Roe v. Wade. Lucas had wandered out of his room in search of food, unaware that he'd passed almost 2 days in cyberspace without bathing. Which in itself was not unusual, but Lucas had also forgotten that he wore the Toy Story PJs his mother had bought him for Christmas. Lucas had not said a word when George had looked at him and his Buzz Lightyear pajamas and burst out in laughter. Instead he'd pulled himself up straight, shoulders back like his mother had taught him, and returned to his room. He'd emerged, clean and suitably attired a half-hour later, his fury simmering, ready to confront George. But George was gone, busy on the ground somewhere, and Lucas was left alone with his anger. Soon, as was all too often the case, he found himself in his father's bedroom, a red rage blurring his vision as he searched for something, someone, anything to hit. But all that had faded into distant memory the moment he arrived in the ER and saw Grace. Ah, Grace. Those deep, blue eyes of hers had promised him so much, the healing touch of her hands, so gentle yet so strong. The way she'd listened with interest, never challenging his story that he was a brown belt in karate. The way she'd looked at him really, truly at him like no one else had ever done. Love at first sight. Of course, Lucas was too shy to approach her directly. And she was far too reserved to ever tell him how she felt. Besides, she was a doctor, had a code of honor, she couldn't become involved with a patient. But she found many little ways to show her affection for him, to prove her love. Lucas began to volunteer at Angels of Mercy, a hardship since he didn't drive, and refused to allow George, or anyone from his past to cloud the perfect future he was building. Every time he was there, Grace would do something to communicate with him. She'd taken to wearing a special pin, an enameled blue ribbon that matched her eyes, on her lab coat, and he knew it was to show him how much she cared. Another time, she thanked him for wheeling a patient to X-ray for her. Once she'd even been so bold as to smile at him as they rode the elevator together. There were other people, so he couldn't return her affection, but he still remembered the warm, tingling feeling it had ignited inside him. He began to follow her. She lived in a bad neighborhood, not far from the hospital, so he'd watch over her, frighten off any men who tried to bother her. There was one, a big guy, old, much too old, who kept coming back despite Lucas' best efforts. Jimmy Moran. The name made him grimace in his sleep. Then he smiled. He'd shown Moran who was boss. Moran had somehow convinced Grace to leave Lucas. It had been months before he'd found her again, living at Moran's house. He knew there was nothing going on, Grace would never betray him, and besides, Moran was too old for her. It was Lucas she loved, Lucas she wanted. He finally built up the courage to approach her, invite her home with him. But Moran was too fast. He took Grace with him out of the country, far away from Lucas. For 6 weeks Lucas had watched and waited for them to return, collecting gossip from the ER until he finally had news that Grace was coming back. The people in the ER said she'd married Moran, but he knew that was a lie. A vicious lie Moran spread to keep her under his control. Grace would never betray Lucas or their love. He remembered waiting. It was dark and raining. Waiting for Grace to come back to him. That's when his dream collapsed into nightmare. Moran and Grace kissing passionately on the stoop under the bright spotlight, Grace leaving, and Lucas knowing it was his one chance to save her from Moran. Then blood everywhere, raining on him, spurting up at him, splattering his mouth, his hands, his face until everything he saw was clouded in red, and the world tasted of copper, the sound of a man's cries swirling around him in a crimson tsunami. Then Grace was there. He turned to her, to show her what he'd done for her, how he'd protected her. Waited for her cry of joy. She had screamed, ran to save Moran. He tried to swallow his rage, to understand how Moran had confused and brainwashed her. But she'd begged for Moran's life, offered herself in his stead. Then he saw the gold wedding bands on her finger. The evil emerald winking at him in the lamplight, the newer bright gold band woven through with foreign runes and spells. He knew then that it was too late, his Grace had crossed over to the other side. Moran had won. The roar of a man's spirit erupting, being torn from his body, had filled all his senses. Lucas had no idea how much time passed before he looked down at Grace's limp, blooded, ravaged body and realized he had lost everything. Blood steamed through Jimmy's veins, skimming through the dark alleys of his body to return to his heart, filling his atria and ventricles with rich molecules laden with iron, heme, and oxygen, the essence of life. It was a miracle. A heartbeat where it shouldn't, when it shouldn't, but with unfaltering rhythm, as if it might continue to beat forever. Despite his steady heartbeat promising a long life to come, Jimmy was more exhausted than he'd ever been in life. Sleep did nothing to revitalize him. Instead it sapped him further, stealing his breath, his strength. Jimmy groaned in his sleep, unable to escape the weight crushing his chest, caught in a desperate search for sustenance. He was starving, body and soul, time racing away from him. His dreams were dark and desperate. A dank London alley where the rancid smell of rotting fish barely made a dent in the stench of unwashed humanity. A dark cloaked figure searching, needing, wanting. Then finding what he looked for in the figure of a half-dressed woman, wheedling to him from a butcher's doorway. Jimmy tried to run, to turn away, but he was caught in the bloodlust. Rich, steaming crimson bathed his senses, filling his nostrils with the welcome smell of copper and terror, quenching his all-consuming thirst. Her warm, glistening entrails slipped through his fingers while she moaned, exhaled her last breath. He took his time, reveling in the moment, in the power, the sensations crashing over him, squelching the hunger. The woman called out his name, opened her eyes, and it was Grace writhing beneath his fingers, Grace's blood drying in a sticky dark sheen on his face and hands, Grace's cries for mercy which had fed his soul. He rose to his feet, towering over her, inhaling her essence and despising the mere mortals who huddled in their dark caverns, unknowing and unseeing, and he howled at the moon. This was life. This was why he returned. This primal hunger, this passion, this power. The corpse in the gutter at his feet began to cool. His bloodlust grew, consuming him, vanquishing the man he once was. Now he was a creature of the night, beyond the laws of man or God. Chapter 32. Half past dead. Jimmy forced himself awake, fought to banish the nightmare. He was pinned to the bed by a heavy weight, crushing him, stealing his breath. He panicked, his eyes flew open, and he saw the weight was Alex. How the boy's frail body could have seemed a crushing force he had no idea, but it had brought him back to reality, so that was all that counted. He blinked, surprised that somewhere beyond the grey clouds scudding through the sky visible through the window, the sun must be up. He wanted to raise his head, look at the clock, but it took all his energy merely to keep his eyes open. And to breathe. As if his time on earth had dwindled to the point where it was now measured by each beat of his heart. The swoosh of the machine that kept Alex's lungs inflated mixed with the boy's raspy breaths. Jimmy inhaled and the stench of death and decay nearly choked him. Then, before he could stop himself, he drew another breath in, this one shuddering through him, and tasted the fresh energy of youth and innocence, of a life about to be cut short, of rich blood waiting to be shed. Jesus Mary Patrick, no. He pushed himself upright, trembling hands gently rolling Alex off his chest, freeing himself from the boy's embrace. His palms left sweat marks on Alex's pajama tops. Jimmy's entire body had broken out in a cold sweat, drenching the sheets, turning them into clammy swaths that clung to him, holding him fast. Jimmy reached for Grace. Her touch would banish these insane feelings that threatened to devour him. She was all he needed. Grace was gone. That jolted him from bed. He staggered across the floor, bracing himself against the wall, as far from the sleeping children as he could get. His stomach lurched in anticipation as his gaze fell on Kat, curled up on the chair, the faint, silver light escaping the clouds bathing her in a glow of innocence. He licked his lips, tasting blood once more, knowing the thrill of encircling her throat with his hands, squeezing the life out of her, capturing her last breath as his own. No. The single syllable escaped his lips in a strangled whisper. He stumbled through the door, pulling it tight behind him, a flimsy barrier between him and madness. His gaze darted down the hall. Where was Grace? His entire body shook with need, his legs threatened to dump him onto the floor, he felt so weak. A familiar figure beckoned to him from the janitor's closet across the hall. Jimmy slit his eyes at the silver-haired man, now outfitted in a green custodian's jumpsuit. Leo. The devil himself. As he staggered across the hall, he wondered how the blood of an immortal and conniving Jesuit would taste. Now you know why so few make it as far as you have, Leo greeted him with a knowing half-smile. It must be difficult being here, surrounded by all this easy prey. You could have warned me, Jimmy said through gritted teeth. This was how the others before him had lasted more than their allotted time, they had bought their way with the blood of innocence. Not merely blood, but devouring their energy, stealing away all that remained once they died. You wouldn't have believed me if I had. Besides, Leo's smile widened, stubborn Irishman that you are, would you have really changed your mind? Turned your back on Grace when she needs you most? Jimmy choked back his desire to see how well his fingers fit around the monk's scrawny neck. You know I wouldn't. But at least I would have been prepared. Leo merely shrugged. Too late now. Just like it's almost too late for Grace. She made the wrong choice. Sealed her fate. He scowled as if Jimmy were to blame. And maybe, mine as well. What? Where is she? Jimmy straightened, fought to clear his mind, focus on what was important, on why he had returned. How could he have allowed himself to fall asleep, to lose her again? He was meant to watch over her, protect her. On her way to the tower. She broke her promise to Vincent, made a pact with Hellman. Jimmy spun on his heel, ready to bolt after Grace. If he hurts one hair on her head, I'll throttle the man. Leo pushed a mop and bucket against the doorway, blocking Jimmy's escape. Now, Jimmy. Haven't you learned anything? You shed blood, anyone's blood, while you're here and you'll never see Grace again. You'll never be again except as trillions of subatomic particles blasted into the void. Kabam, Jimmy breathed, remembering Alex's colorful description of hell and those banished there. Kabam indeed, Leo said in a dry tone. The end of existence as you know it. The end of any hope you or Grace have of being together ever again. He stared at the Jesuit. Hell, this was no priest, no man of God. Vampire was more like it. But you do it. And you still here. Leo shook his head. I've never killed. I merely take what is there to take already. Now Jimmy understood. All those years, giving comfort to the dying. Those missions to war-torn countries, to relieve suffering you said. But that's not really why you do it. You surround yourself with the dying, absorbing their energy, hoarding it, using it to keep yourself alive. I do what I must. I told you, I have a destiny to fulfill. One that Grace is currently jeopardizing. Only you can stop her, save her. Clarity sundered the clouds of confusion. You don't care about Grace. All you care about is yourself. Jimmy thought hard, pieced together bits of conversation, clues Leo had dangled. You? The real you, the you living now. You're coming here, getting ready to do something that ends with your death. You want Grace to save you, you selfish bastard. All this, he waved his hands, to save your sorry life. Leo's glare hit Jimmy with a physical intensity. Not just me. My entire family. Maybe the entire future. It's all up to Grace. She's the only one left who can save us. But you said if she does, she'll die. What do you care? Leo retorted. Then you too will have all eternity. As long as you behave yourself, don't give in to temptation. Don't you worry about me, little man. Jimmy straightened, his body crowding the Jesuit into the corner. Tell me what Grace is really fighting. What or who do you want her to stop? Leo's mouth twisted, and for a moment Jimmy thought he might actually tell him the truth instead of these damn riddles about free will and choice. But then Leo shook his head with regret. Go now, Jimmy, or you'll never see her again before time is up. For both of you. Grace sagged against the corner of the elevator, eyes tightly shut in an attempt to make the world stop spinning around her, ready to hurl her out into darkness. Eve's voice droned on beside her, undercutting the deafening buzz of the wasps that now spiraled through her brain, her chest, into every private crevice of her mind and body. I thought you were a doctor, Eve said, her fingers squeezing Grace's arm with bruising force. How can you turn your back on all the people you could help? Even if Jonah's technique doesn't save you, he could use it to save hundreds once he perfects it. You know as well as anyone that medical breakthroughs take trial and error. A breath of fresh air and swoosh of sound told Grace that the elevator doors had opened. Her stomach still lurched upwards. Before she had a chance to regain her equilibrium, Eve tightened her grip on Grace's arm, hauling her out of the metal box. Grace stumbled and opened her eyes. They were at the annex doors to the Skyway. The helipad door across the way shook as a gust of wind slammed against the building. Pounding footsteps echoed from the stairwell beside them. The door flew open, banging against the wall with a shotgun crack. Jimmy raced out. He stopped when he saw Grace, hands up before him as if bracing himself for a blow. He looked so pale. Wraith-like. Grace shuddered at the words and wrenched her arm free of Eve, falling into his embrace. The wasps vanished, replaced by the warm constancy of his heartbeat thudding against her. Christ Almighty! His breath stirred her hair as he lowered his head to hers. I thought I'd never see you again. Thought I'd lost you for good. She said nothing, her fingers digging into the flesh of his back as she strained to pull him closer still. He was drenched in sweat, his chest heaving as if it took all his energy to remain here with her, and for the first time she realized what his return had cost him. They clung to each other, shrouded in their separate mortalities until Eve's mincing drawl sliced between them. Excuse me, but you'll need to say goodbye now. Grace is a very sick woman, and she needs to begin her treatment. Now, she added in a commanding voice when Grace didn't relinquish her grip on Jimmy. Grace inhaled his scent, drank him in, as if he had what she needed to sustain her through eternity. His lips caressed her head, christening the shaved area where Hellman had tunneled into her brain, then his fingers framed her face, raising it to meet his. Their kiss was deep, like falling into a star-filled night, familiar and comforting and passionate and magical. Finally they parted. About time, Eve said, reaching a hand to take Grace's arm. No buzz of fear, not now with Jimmy holding her. Grace effortlessly shook free of the woman's grasp. I'll meet you on the Skyway, she told Eve, marveling at how steady and firm her voice was. I don't believe that's a good idea. You can watch me through the windows. Make sure I don't run away. Eve gave Jimmy a long, hungry look, then shrugged her agreement. All right, but you could just bring him along. I'd make sure he feels right at home. Jimmy dismissed the other woman with a chuckle that rekindled Grace's resolve. In your dreams. She nodded to the glass door, relegating Eve to the role of spectator. I'd like a moment with my husband. Eve arched her eyebrow. Didn't realize you had remarried. Grace and Jimmy were silent, staring into each other's eyes, the other woman already forgotten. The clatter of Eve's heels echoed against the linoleum, then faded away. I've been thinking, Grace started, leaning her body against Jimmy's, her head tilted up to meet his eyes. All that mumbo-jumbo talk about voids and dissolution, it really boils down to simple laws of physics, doesn't it? Jimmy waited a moment before answering, busy nuzzling her hair. If you say so. You're the scientist, the one who needs answers. Matter cannot be created nor destroyed, merely changed in form. He traced a finger up the side of her body, caressing her. But this is a nice bit of matter, don't you think? I'm rather partial to your form just the way it is. Stop it, I'm serious. If we can change from one form to another, if we can learn to do it once, why can't we do it at will? How could she let him go without some hope that she might someday have him again? He frowned, the cutest little worry line digging its way into his brow. Something to think about, love. Anything is possible. If anyone could do it, you could. She pressed her hips against his, turned her head to kiss the sensitive skin at the base of his neck. I'm not talking about me, fool. I'm talking about you. Act now, I'm not too sure on that. Not too sure how I got here in the first place exactly. And if I try to stay, well, let's just say the price to pay is mighty high. She grabbed his hands, held them between them, a bridge between their hearts. But you did get here, Jimmy. If you could do it once, you could do it again. Silence. Her heart stuttered with disappointment. Maybe she would never see him again. No, she couldn't accept that. Not after everything they'd been through. At least promise me you'll try. For you, love. Anything. He sealed their bargain with another deep kiss that resonated through her, almost crumpling her resolve. How could she possibly leave him, face a world without him? A sharp rapping on the skyway door brought her to her senses. Jimmy took her hand and walked her through the doors. She remembered their wedding day, Brother Leo beaming down on them, presenting them to a church filled with Jimmy's friends and family, who had embraced this stranger from a strange land and welcomed her into their home. She'd felt so light that she was certain that her feet had never touched the ground as Jimmy led her down the aisle, proudly presenting his wife to all. The best day of her life. No matter what had happened after, she would never forget the way he made her feel that day. She could never regret her love for him. She squeezed his hand, saw the gleam of tears in his eyes and knew he was thinking the same thing. Reaching her left hand up, she stroked her fingers along his cheekbone. He turned his face to kiss her palm, leaving a warm reminder of what once was. Watch over the kids. Keep them safe. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard and nodded. Her fingers lingered against his lips for a moment before she turned to follow Eve across the skyway. Every step brought a thunderclap of agony. Grace felt her legs shake uncontrollably as her body was racked with nausea. She fought to keep her back straight, refusing to allow Jimmy to see her pain. No matter what he did, Eve said as she held the door to the tower open for Grace, Lucas Redding truly loved you. He still does. He's waiting for you. Now? A savage howl of agony crashed down on Grace as the door slammed shut behind her. She took one more step and fell to the ground, drowning in a black tide of pain. Chapter 33 Rebel Cry. When he heard Eve Warden's words, realized what truly awaited Grace in the tower, Jimmy catapulted himself across the divide that separated him from Grace. And was immediately slapped back. The universe dissolved into red-hot daggers of pain. He was hurled back along the length of the skyway, propelled with such force that he crashed through the annex doors and landed in a heap on the floor in front of the elevators. He rolled to his feet, shaking the sense back into his sight, ignoring the booming in his ears, and rushed through the helipad door, hoping to catch a glimpse of Grace, to somehow bring her back. Instead, all that greeted him for his efforts was a dank, swirling mist and leaden clouds shaped like anvils pressing down so low from the heavens they felt ready to crush a puny human such as himself. He cried out, demanding attention, recourse, vengeance. Thunder swallowed his shouts of desperation and rage. Finally, his energy spent, he sank to the grit-covered roof, his body drenched, shivering with fatigue and anger. Rain pelted him from every direction, and the wind had no mercy. He gulped in deep draughts of frigid, bracing air. What was the good of coming all this way only to lose her? Warm tears of frustration thawed the frozen skin of his face, as he pounded a fist against his thigh. Where was Leo, cursed bastard, now? No, it was as much Jimmy's fault as Leo's. When he'd held her, she had reeked of terror, He'd tasted her fear in every kiss. Fool that he was, he thought it was the same old fear that had driven her into hiding for the past 4 years. Idiot. Arrogant bastard. He'd thought she was afraid of losing him again, of reopening wounds still festering. Jimmy got to his feet, pacing along the parapet parallel to the skyway. It was painful to admit, but some small part of him had delighted in the fact that her love for him was so strong, so all-consuming, that she'd sacrificed everything for it. She'd built a life around his memory, refusing the rest of the world entry. He stopped at the edge of the roof, the closest to the tower he could physically go, and stared across the void. But today, it wasn't losing Jimmy that Grace was afraid of. It was facing the man who had destroyed their lives, who had almost killed her once. Redding, the murdering bastard. No. Jimmy shouted into the sky so dark that it could be noon or midnight. I won't let you. You'll not be getting your hands on her, not again. The wind scudded layers of clouds aside for one brief moment. A rose-tinged shaft of golden light pierced the grey, a beacon of hope at Jimmy's feet. He stretched his arm out, the light playing off his wedding ring. To hell with Leo and his plans to save the universe. Bugger that. He would find a way to save Grace. This time he would not fail her. The thin sliver of light was banished as quickly as it had come. Thunder bounced off the buildings, echoing through Jimmy's head along with Leo's words. There are rules, me boy. Rules that no one can break. Fuck you and the horse you rode in on. The shout of emancipation renewed Jimmy's strength. Fuck the rules and the universe and everyone in it. I'm not letting him win again. Lightning crashed between the buildings, raising the hairs on Jimmy's head and blinding him for a moment. He held his ground, refusing to bow. Then he turned. At first, his steps were the slow jerking of a marionette rebelling against its master. Wind lashed at him, trying to force him back from the doorway, prevent him returning to the battleground, but Jimmy kept pushing forward. His legs stretched out into lengthy, purposeful strides. Then he was jogging, sprinting through the door and across the lobby, down the steps to pediatrics. She had told him to look to the children, keep a watch over them. She had sacrificed everything for the sake of the children. Maybe they were Jimmy's last hope to save Grace. Vincent should have been making rounds, but Eve had invited him to help her with Grace's brain mapping. A chance to see Lucidine therapy in action, she had said. She'd seemed fine, hadn't mentioned the strange occurrences of last night. In fact, she seemed to be the only person around here who was acting normal today. He grabbed coffee, stopped by medical records to sign some charts, then took the tower elevator up to the ECU. He wasn't stalling because he was nervous about facing Grace, he told himself. No, not at all. In fact, he wanted to see her, to follow her treatment course. Once the tumor was gone, things would be so much different. Maybe they could even start over. The elevator doors slid open. Grace lay in a heap on the floor in the lobby. Eve bowed over her, trying to revive her. What happened? He rushed to Grace's side. Her breathing was normal, but her color awful, skin clammy, and pulse thready. She fainted, Eve said, brushing wrinkles from her tailored linen slacks as she stood. Back home, we called them the vapors. You sure it's not the tumor? Maybe we should call Hellman. Grace stirred beneath his fingers, her eyes fluttering open. He flicked a pen light into her pupils. Equal size, reactive. She began to push herself upright, and he guided her to a sitting position, his arm around her shoulders. Are you all right? Her muscles shuddered beneath his touch, but she nodded. He helped her to her feet and together they entered the ECU, following Eve into the first treatment room. Go ahead, get her into a patient gown and on the monitor, Eve said. I'll need a line started as well. She left, relegating Vincent to duties usually performed by a nurse or med student. He watched the door swing shut behind Eve, then turned to Grace, who sat on the exam table, her feet dangling off the floor. She looked at him with an expression of disgust. Guess he deserved that after betraying her to Eve. Not to mention putting his job before her needs. Even if those needs were irrational. Do you have any idea what you're getting into? She asked, making no move to change into the patient gown he handed her. Helping Eve prepare you for Hellman's surgery. He stared at her in concern. You do remember about the surgery? The brain mapping. She said nothing but shook her head at him, as if he were an idiot or worse. Then she kicked her shoes off, stood barefoot on the tiled floor, and began to strip out of her scrubs. He turned his back, fumbling with the four supplies. This is the best thing, he said, his back still to her. For who? You or Eve Warden? For you, of course. He spun around. She was tying the gown behind her, but somehow she didn't look dwarfed or weakened by the change from a physician's garb to the revealing patient's gown. Somehow she managed to make the usually humiliating costume appear regal. Her eyes blazed across the room at him, challenging him. He lowered his gaze, approaching her as she settled back onto the table. I need to hook you up to the monitor. She lay back on the thin mattress, watching him with those intense blue eyes, as he pulled the adhesive backing off of the monitor leads and skimmed his hands under her gown to press them against the skin near her breasts. Hellman is giving Alex his DNR, she finally said. He pivoted, turning the monitor on. The steady beat of her heart echoed through the room. It was his own pulse that was racing. He reached out to lower the volume on the machine. So you won, he said, surprised at how bitter his words emerged. She grabbed his hand, her grip tighter than he'd expected from such a small woman. No, Vincent. I didn't win. Alex did. He met her eyes, overwhelmed by their fierce intensity. Finally he looked away, trying to ignore the trembling of his hand when she released him. She remained silent, as he began and fore in a vein on the back of her left hand. The bright fluorescent lights made her emerald ring wink at him, as if it shared a joke with its owner, a joke at his expense. Damn it, why did he have to feel this way about her? She'd never give up Jimmy Moran. A mere human like Vincent had no hope of competing against a ghostly legend. Eve returned, now wearing a lab coat over her ruby-colored silk blouse and black slacks. She hadn't pulled her hair back this morning, it cascaded over her shoulders in a gleaming shower of pure light. Fragments of memory from last night flew through his brain, as she brushed past him, and he inhaled her shampoo. For a moment he was drowning in the rich fragrance of orchids, felt her hair skimming over his naked flesh, heard her cries of passion. He stepped back, out of range of Eve's intoxicating scent, and saw Grace watching him. He felt himself flush and swallowed hard to regain his composure. Eve deftly drew up the Lucidine and began the infusion. I'm using a higher dose than recommended. She broke through last time, she told Vincent, ignoring Grace who lay beneath her, still awake, although now immobilized by the Lucidine. Last time. During her biopsy. Woke up just as Hellman was drilling into her brain. He was not pleased. He could imagine. He could also imagine how terrifying that would have been for the patient, but Eve made no mention of that. Instead, she watched as Grace's vitals stabilized, her body totally flaccid. Eve raised one of Grace's hands, allowed it to drop without resistance onto Grace's face, then flop off to hang at her side. Eve looked over at him. Grace lay beneath them, between them, able to hear everything they said, although unable to respond. She's a skinny bitch, isn't she? Aren't you going to put the goggles and headset on her? Control her stimuli for the mapping? He asked, trying to steer the conversation back to professional ground. Instead Eve grabbed his hand, forced it down over Grace's breast. You like them scrawny with boy tits like her, Vincent? She asked, her fingernails digging into his skin. Is that why you called out her name last night? When I was giving you the best night of your life? Vincent tried to pull away, used his free hand to wrench her fingers back. Eve's face filled with pain and she cried out. He immediately released her, remembering the bruises he had caused last night. What the hell was wrong with him? He backed away from the table, from both women. Eve, I'm sorry. She rubbed her wrist and he saw red marks already forming there. Then she looked up at him with a smile, her white teeth glistening in the bright lights. That's all right, Vincent. We'll work things out. She whirled around, stepped to the door, and opened it. Vincent watched in surprise as the woman he'd met in Eve's office yesterday pushed a gurney inside, drawing it up along the far wall. A male patient lay on it, a man in his 30s, his head shaved, eyes closed, a sheet drawn up to his chin. Eve whisked the sheet away to reveal the man beneath. He wasn't a large man, but both his arms and legs were secured to the gurney with leather restraints thick enough to hold a rampaging gorilla in place. Is your heart racing? This is just the tip of the iceberg. Subscribe to our channel, and don't miss a single thrilling twist in Grace's story.